Hi, I'm Bob Fringley, and I'm here to tell you the incredible story of how personal computers took over the world. Why am I telling you this at a basketball game? Well, I like the game, but mainly it's because of that guy down there. His name is Paul Allen, and everything you see here belongs to him. The Portland Trail Blazers basketball team, their arena, even the dancers. Thanks to personal computers, he has $8 billion to spend on such toys. 20 years ago, Allen and his high school friend Bill Gates were running a two-man software company called Microsoft. Today, Allen is richer than God, and Gates is richer than Allen. 20 years ago, young men like Paul Allen and Bill Gates invented the personal computer, and in doing so launched a revolution that's changed the way we live, work, and communicate. It's hard to believe that 20 years ago there were no personal computers. Now it's the third largest industry in the world, somewhere between energy production and illegal drugs. But the most amazing thing of all is that it happened by accident, because a bunch of disenfranchised nerds wanted to impress their friends. This is the story of how a handful of guys launched an industrial revolution, how they changed the culture of business, how they made history.
I feel incredibly lucky to be at exactly the right place in Silicon Valley, at exactly the right time historically where this invention has taken form.
It wasn't like we both thought it was going to go a long ways. It was like, we'll both do it for fun, and even though we're going to lose some money probably, we'll just have been able to say we had a company.
All of us would get together and just hope we were right, that the PC would become a big thing.
You know, I stop and say, wow, the PC really has become part of the very fabric of the way people live. And we've certainly surged with it, and I just stop and say, pretty incredible ride.
Most of these people come from the place I call home, the Silicon Valley south of San Francisco, California. Growing up here near the electronics companies that give the place its name, these founders of the PC revolution were, for the most part, middle-class white kids from good suburban homes. But it's not their homes we're interested in, it's their garages. This is my garage, and this is all my junk. I'm probably one of the few guys in Silicon Valley who actually has room in his garage for a car. Most everyone else seems to use theirs to start computer companies and create great fortunes. But I don't have a fortune. I'm a failure. I've written computer programs that almost ran, and I've designed and built hardware devices that frankly didn't work at all. But I'm the ideal guy to tell the story of the personal computer business because I'm its premier gossip columnist. And everyone tells me all their secrets. And this is my home, where I write a gossip column for a computing magazine. Sorry about the mess. Institutions in constant change like the PC industry are driven by rumor and gossip, and I thrive on both. My electronic mail address is deluged with inside information about everything from product flaws to who's sleeping with whom. What ties these gossipers together is a desire for truth. These people and their love of technology have fueled the PC revolution. To understand them is to understand that revolution. So let's go find some.
Yeah, it is. Smart. Whatever. Speaking.
Meet Edwin Chin on a Saturday morning at the Weird Stuff Warehouse. This could be 1976 or 1996, because there is always a new generation of techies like Edwin who hear the calling. Most other kids are watching TV, but not Edwin.
You know, I'm interested in electronics and technologies and a hobby since I started when I was like 6 or 7, you know.
How old are you now, Edwin?
10 right now.
It's no coincidence that the only woman in the vicinity looks bored. Because this is a boy thing, the obsession of a particular type of boy who would rather struggle with an electronic box than with a world of unpredictable people. We call them engineers, programmers, hackers, and techies, but mainly, we call them nerds.
I think a nerd is a person who uses the telephone to talk to other people about telephones. And a computer nerd, therefore, is somebody who uses a computer in order to use a computer.
And people have like different degrees of passion, different types of passion. You know, some people like, they just like live databases, and like fifth normal form is just like nirvana, and like they just quest for it, you know. Like that's like what gets them up in the morning.
What do your friends think of you?
Boy, he's a nerd. Yeah. But I don't mind. I'm used to being called a nerd. Can't have other people stop your dreams.
You've got a very wide wire.
And in Silicon Valley, the dream is to grow up to become a boy like this.
It doesn't make any difference at all to you whether it's on one of this machine.
Graham Spencer is chief programmer for Architects Software. 6 guys who graduated from Stanford University and started a company just because they like each other. This is a modern-day startup, but at heart, it's no different from PC pioneers like Apple or Microsoft. Nerds who share a dream. Their hobby is their business, and the culture they've created is identical to that of 1,000 other technology companies. First, they dumped the idea of 9 to 5. In this industry, you can work any 80 hours per week you like.
And then I've got my cap, which I use to cover my eyes and
Oh, yes.
sleep in the early morning while everybody's coming in.
We didn't even obey a 24-hour clock. We'd come in and program for a couple days straight. We'd, 4 or 5 of us, when it was time to eat, we'd all get in our cars and kind of race over to the restaurant and sit and talk about what we were doing. Sometimes I'd get excited talking about things I'd forget to eat, but then we'd just go back and program some more. It was us and our friends. Those were fun days.
Let's look in the refrigerator. Whoa, we have Coke and cold pizza.
I drink about 2 liters of Coke a day. I
2 liters of Coke a day.
Yeah.
And do you think of it like as brain food?
That keeps me going. That and, listen to heavy metal and get caffeinated and hack.
I'd sit down in my room on the floor with sheets of paper spread all around with my computer design I was working on, and always I noticed that I was up pretty late at night and I had lots of Cokes, just part of that life.
Combination of stale pizza and body odor and sort of spilt cola kind of ground into the rug.
I'd brought some spaghetti to work and then forgot to wash out the container for the last couple of days, maybe 6 or 7 if I had to be honest. Ooh, that smells bad.
Eating, bathing, having a girlfriend, having an active social life is incidental. It gets in the way of code time. Writing code is the primary force that drives our lives. So anything that interrupts that is wasteful.
What is it about the internal logic of a computer that's so enticing? For one thing, such logic can be understood, as opposed to things that can't be understood at all, like the motivations of young women, say, or of the French. Let me explain. Time for the Cringely Crash Course in Basic Computers, Part 1. This is a mainframe computer. All of these cabinets are one machine. In the old days, all computers were this size. They were tended by engineers in white coats, a kind of priesthood who took their jobs very seriously. Now, all computers work pretty much the same, whether it's a giant that serves 2,000 users like this one, or a little notebook that serves only me. They process numerical data, adding, multiplying, comparing. Fact is, if you can quantify it, a computer can handle it. It's the emotional stuff they don't know what to do with. The data must be put into a special binary code consisting only of ones and zeros. And you have to give the computer instructions, also in code, to tell it exactly what to do with the data and in what order. These instructions are called a program. In the early days, you put in the instructions by flipping switches or loaded them from paper tape. This was called machine language. It made computers a pain to use. Even worse, every type of computer spoke a different machine language.
While the ENIAC could compute the 30-second trajectory of a shell in 20 seconds, operators required 2 days to program it to do so.
Then a U.S. Navy captain named Grace Hopper solved the problem. She invented a computer language, English words that the computer itself could translate into binary code. Now users could type whole lists of instructions into a computer rather than flipping those damn switches. Like most things having to do with computers, that first language had a silly name, COBOL. It was followed by other languages like Fortran and BASIC, and they all made computing just a bit more user-friendly. So when some nerd tells you he's been up all night programming or writing software or hacking code, what he really means is he's been typing long lists of instructions into his computer. Mainframe computers were far from personal. They sat in big air-conditioned rooms at insurance companies, phone companies, and the bank, and their main function was to get us confused with some other guy named Cringely who was a deadbeat and had a criminal record. Eventually, computer terminals did begin to appear in some schools, but most of us paid no attention. But there was usually one kid who did pay attention, falling in love with the digital purity of those ones and zeros. He was the nerd.
And I took this book home that described the PDP-8 computer, and it was just like a Bible to me. I mean, all these things that for some reason I'd fallen in love with, like you might fall in love with a card game called Magic, or you might fall in love with doing crossword puzzles or something else, or playing a musical instrument. I fell in love with these little descriptions of computers on their inside, and it was a little mathematics. I could work out some problems on paper and solve it and see how it's done, and I could come up with my own solutions and feel good inside.
So you would keyboard these commands in, and then you would wait for a while, and then the thing would go and it would tell you something out. But even with that, it was still remarkable, especially for a 10-year-old, that you could write a program in BASIC, let's say, or Fortran, and actually this machine would sort of take your idea and it would sort of execute your idea and give you back some results. And if they were the results that you predicted, your program really worked. It was an incredibly thrilling experience.
Nerds wanted their own computers right from the beginning, but it took a technological breakthrough to make that possible. This is it, the chip, the microprocessor. This is what allows you to have a mainframe computer on your desk. In the 1950s, mainframes were as big as this garage, and that's because they were filled with thousands of these vacuum tubes or valves. Eventually, the valves were made much smaller and replaced with transistors, still too big, however, to make a computer that could fit on your desk. What that took was further miniaturization. Here we have a single piece of silicon etched with thousands of transistors. This microprocessor holds more than 1 million transistors, and that's the secret of the personal computer. And that's why they call it Silicon Valley, not Computer Valley. These are the people who invented the microprocessor, Intel. Intel was started 28 years ago by a handful of guys after a row with their old boss. Their microprocessors today power 85% of the world's computers. Intel not only invented the chip, they are responsible for the laid-back Silicon Valley working style. Everyone was on a first-name basis. There were no reserved parking places, no offices, only cubicles. It's still true today. Here's the chairman's cubicle. Knock, knock. Yeah, I've knocked on the door, but there's no door. Gordon Moore is one of the Intel founders, worth $3 billion. With money like that, I'd have a door.
In a business like this, the people with the power are the ones that have the understanding of what's going on, not necessarily the ones on top. It's very important that those people that have the knowledge are the ones that make the decisions. So we set up something where everyone who had the knowledge had an equal say in what was going on.
Intel's microprocessors kept getting more powerful. They soon had enough horsepower to run a whole computer. Only Intel didn't appreciate the brilliance of their own product, seeing it as useful mainly for calculators or traffic lights. Intel had all the elements necessary to invent the PC business, but they just didn't get it. Lucky for us, someone did. This is the chip that launched the personal computer revolution. This is the magazine that announced it. In January 1975, featured on the cover was the world's first personal computer, the Altair 8800. It was the crazy idea of an ex-Air Force officer from Georgia, Ed Roberts.
If you look at it, it was kind of a grandiose, almost megalomaniac kind of scheme, And right now I couldn't do it because I could see right off there's no way you could do this. There isn't any way you could do this. But at that time, we just lacked the benefits of age and experience. We didn't know we couldn't do it.
20 years after Ed Roberts' flash of brilliance, this exhibit is being held to celebrate the anniversary of the Altair. Like every other PC pioneer, Ed built his computer just because he wanted one to play with.
There were some of us that lusted after computers, really, at that time. All the computers in the world tended to be in big centers, and you had to get permission to get close to them, and it was, nobody had access to computers then. And the idea that you could have your own computer and do whatever you wanted to with it, whenever you wanted to, was fantastic.
And where was all this happening? It was far from Silicon Valley, Intel, or IBM. Out in the desert near the airport in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Ed Roberts ran a calculator company called MITS. Having an ugly building wasn't its only problem. MITS was going bankrupt. Nobody was buying calculators, and Ed needed $65,000 just to stay afloat.
We went to the bank and had a late night meeting, and the issue was whether we closed MITS down or they loaned us an additional $65,000. And I was asked how many machines that I think we would sell in the next year after it was introduced. And I said 800, and was considered a wild-eyed optimist at that. Within a month after it was introduced, we were getting 250 orders a day. Started about 6.
The Altair wasn't even a computer. It was a computer kit.
Whoa, this is a pretty well-equipped machine.
You had to build it yourself, and even then it usually didn't work. Still, the demand was amazing.
And there were actually people that came to MITS, a couple people with camper trailers, and camped out in the parking lot waiting for their machine. I mean, they were so eager.
I think everybody had sort of daydreamed, or Walter Mitty, about owning a computer. The surprise was that it would be possible for the average college student, for example, who was living on bare subsistence, to actually buy a computer.
This is what really amazed me, was that people were there was a sort of a pent-up demand for having your own computer.
And if it could be that cheap, what a wonderful thing.
This is an Altair computer, the first personal computer. And not just any Altair. This is Altair serial number 2, the second one made. The first Altair made was sent off to be photographed at a magazine and was lost in the mail. So this is the oldest personal computer in the world. Pretty historic junk, but the question is, what do you do with it? It has a front panel with switches that you can click back and forth and some lights, but in the back, there's no place to connect a keyboard, there's no place to connect a monitor, there's no place to connect a printer. In fact, there's practically nothing at all that you can really do with this thing. But back then, 1975, the people who had it were thrilled. The nerds formed clubs to talk about their new toy. One of the first was the Homebrew Computer Club, which met on Wednesday evenings in a hall rented from Stanford University in Silicon Valley. Presiding over near anarchy was Lee Felsenstein, who pretended to be in charge.
I would start the meeting by making a horrendous loud noise because everyone was talking and I had to get some attention somehow. And I would use it to call on the person in question. I'd make threatening gestures with it. Most of us were in the electronics industry to a certain extent. There was also a stratum of physicians. And there were a lot of radio amateurs, for instance, finding a new technology that wasn't stale. But most of us were at a sort of middle level downwards. We saw ourselves as crazed, ignored geniuses, or possibly geniuses, but at least we could each hope to get our hands on a computer of our own.
Not much in them.
The very uselessness of the Altair is what drove the hobbyists together. Roger Mellon and Harry Garland started an early computer company. They came here to meet others and to figure out just what the heck could be done with this new toy. A solution in search of a problem.
There's no keyboard that I can see.
The Altair was tedious to use. At first, the only way that data and instructions could be given to the computer was by flipping switches. Take something trivial like 2 plus 2. Each 2 needed 8 different switches to be flipped, then a 9th switch was used to load them all. Add required another 9 switches. The answer 4 was if the third light from the left turned on. Eureka!
So if you had a program that was 100 bytes long, you had to go through this procedure 100 times to load that into memory.
It took a long time.
I bet it did. And what happened if you lost power or you lost your way in the middle?
You cried.
The Altair may have been frustrating, but it drove the nerds to experiment, finding real uses for the useless box, turning it from a curiosity to a computer.
Steve Dampier set up an Altair, laboriously keyed a program into it. Somebody knocked the plug out of the wall, and he had to do that all over again, but nobody knew what this was about. After all, was it just going to sit and flash its lights? No.
You put a little transistor radio next to the Altair, and he would, by manipulating the length of loops in the software, could play tunes.
The radio began playing The Fool on the Hill. Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, in the tinny little tunes that you could tell were coming from the noise that the computer was generated, being picked up by the radio. Everybody rose and applauded. I proposed that he receive the Stripped Phillips Screw Award for finding a use for something previously thought useless. But I think everyone was too busy applauding to even hear me.
It was a very exciting thing. It was probably the first thing the Altair actually did.
Turning the Altair into a useful tool required a programming language so users could type their programs in rather than flipping switches. What it needed was a version of some big computer language like BASIC, only modified for the PC. This was called a basic interpreter, but it didn't yet exist because the experts all thought that not even BASIC was basic enough to fit inside the tiny Altair memory. Yet again, the experts were wrong. Here comes the guy who solved the problem. 20 years after finishing the first microcomputer BASIC, Paul Allen is returning to Albuquerque for a celebration of that event, this time with his $15 million jet and 3-foot red carpet. At a time when I was killing brain cells, this guy was founding an empire. He has come to eat rubber chicken in honor of the Altair's 20th anniversary.
I'd like to introduce to you Paul Allen.
Allen co-founded Microsoft with his younger buddy from high school, Bill Gates.
One day in Boston, I was in Harvard Square, and I covered Popular Electronics with this thing that looked like what I'd been imagining. And so I grabbed it off the shelf, and I looked at it, and I bought it, and I ran back to Bill's dorm, and I think he was probably playing poker that night and usually losing money at that point. One of the few times when that's been the case.
Paul showed that to me. Then, okay, here was a company that would be needing software.
And he said, okay, well, we got to call these guys up and see if this thing is for real.
We realized that things were starting to happen, and just because we'd had a vision for a long time of where this chip could go, what it could mean, that didn't mean the industry was going to wait for us while I stayed and finished my degree at Harvard.
So called up Ed, we told him we've got this BASIC, and it's just, for your machine, and it's not that far from being done, and we'd like to come out and show it to you.
So we created this BASIC interpreter. Paul took the paper tape and flew out. In fact, the night before, he got some sleep while I double-checked everything to make sure that we had it all right.
But I had no idea what it was really going to be like to try to run the software. It had never been run on an actual computer before.
He was very nervous about whether this would actually work. And he got to the office, and we all gathered around, and he put his fingers on the switches, and he loaded BASIC in with paper tape into the Altair.
You know, I was so nervous. It's not going to work. It worked.
And it came up, and it could do a few little simple things.
And it was amazing when Paul called me up and said the thing had worked the first time. And of course it was incredibly fast.
And it printed out memory size, and I think Bill said, well, it printed something. And so I said, yeah.
Oh, that was unbelievable. The fact that it really worked was a breakthrough.
Maybe there wouldn't be a Microsoft if the screen hadn't come alive. Who knows? It might all be quite different.
After the demo succeeded, Bill forgot about finishing university. Afraid of missing his chance to dominate the new industry, he joined Alan in what was then the center of world microcomputing research, among the sleazy bars and gas stations of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And they lived across the street from Mitts in the Sundowner Motel. And the prostitutes and the drug dealers are out on the corner. And they were writing BASIC for the Altair computer. And gradually they actually started Microsoft here in Albuquerque. So
we hired some of our high school friends basically to come down and stay with us in our apartment, which became very crowded.
Well, we were pretty young. We started when I was 19, and so he just had a lot of energy.
They worked really hard. They listened to really loud music. I could hardly stand to go in the software room sometimes because the music would be banging off the walls, mostly acid rock.
You know, we'd usually go out, eat pizzas, and then go out and watch action movies.
They would work all night long, and there were days when Bill Gates would be sleeping on the floor in the software lab, and
sometimes would be Bill and these two other guys all, you know, sitting on tables around the apartment with stacks and stacks of paper, right, converting the BASIC for the 8080.
I still know the source code by heart, and that was a work of love. You know, we just kept tuning and tuning that thing, and so that kind of craftsmanship paid off.
BASIC let the Altair be used for both fun stuff and real work. People attached terminals to the computer and began writing games, word processors, and accounting programs. Most of us didn't notice, but soon there was a thriving industry for enthusiasts. By the end of 1975, dozens of other companies were building microcomputers.
We created an industry, and I think that goes completely unnoticed. I mean, there was nothing. Every aspect of the industry, when you talk about software, hardware, application stuff, dealerships, you name it, was all done at MITS.
It was a wild time. It was a very exciting time. And the first user convention, where we got people to come in and tell us what they were doing, what they were excited about, and other companies like Processor Technology or IMSI or Comemco got going as add-on companies. These companies are long forgotten, but they were the humble beginnings of the PC industry.
Left in the hands of those early hobbyists, the PC might have never made it to the shopping mall. Reaching the wider market required a different type of vision. Enter the flower children of California, who thought the PC was, well, groovy.
From the safety of secret committees, they talk about the danger of war.
Remember that the 60s happened in the early 70s, right? So we have to remember that. And that's sort of when I came of age. So I saw a lot of this. And to me, the spark of that was that there was something beyond sort of what you see every day.
Far from the smell of the gun.
It's the same thing that causes people to want to be poets instead of bankers. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think that that same spirit can be put into products. And those products can be manufactured and given to people, and they can sense that spirit.
To help you understand all this, I will now take off my clothes.
Well, why? He says, well, frame relay is scalable.
Jim Warren knows better than most what the hippie movement did for the PC. A 60s radical himself, he staged the West Coast Computer Fair, for a time the biggest computer show in the world. The fair was where the PC really arrived. It's also where Jim got rich. So, Jim, is this where you hold all your meetings?
As many as possible. Sure, why not?
This is how Silicon Valley entrepreneurs conduct business?
I don't know whether it's how entrepreneurs conduct.
Believe it or not, Jim once taught mathematics at a Catholic girls' school.
Bubbles, Bob?
Sure.
Okay.
Jim was immediately fascinated by the PC, like many Bay Area hippies. The California counterculture was crucial to the PC's development.
And the whole spirit there was working together, was sharing. You shared your dope, you shared your bed, you shared your life, you shared your hopes. And a whole bunch of us had the same community spirit, and that permeated the whole Homebrew Computer Club. As soon as somebody would solve a problem, they'd come running down to the Homebrew Computer Club's next meeting, say, hey everybody, you know that problem that all of us have been trying to figure out how to solve? Here's the solution. Isn't this wonderful? Aren't I a great guy? And it's my contention that that is a major component of why Silicon Valley was able to develop the technology as rapidly as it did, because we were all sharing. Everybody won.
Out of this creative show and tell came Apple Computer, the first mass-market PC company. The Apple founders, a couple of recent graduates from Homestead High, were regulars at homebrew meetings. Steve Wozniak was the technical wizard, and Steve Jobs was the visionary who saw microcomputers as a possible business. The first Apple computer was primitive. It was cobbled together by Woz to impress his friends at the homebrew meetings.
Everybody was interested in computers, so I started getting a crowd around me, because even though I was too shy to raise my hand and say anything in a club meeting, after the club meetings, I would put my computer that I had built, and every week it had a little bit more working on it too. But I would set it down and let people type on the keyboard. I would explain what's in it. If they come up to me and ask a question, I can answer. You know, nowadays, I would have the ability to tell them what it is, you know, and be a little bit more promotional, but back then I could only answer questions if they asked me. But I got a group that started gathering around me. And Steve Jobs saw that I had a lot of interest around me at the club, and he said, let's start selling it. And let's make this company. Came up with the name Apple, and that's how it started.
Apple was at best a funky company, started by a couple of teenage hackers who previously had been working as Alice in Wonderland characters in a local shopping mall. And they started it in this garage right here. The first Apple computer was built here. Now there are more than 10 million in use around the world. And I was there. Well, for a short time, I was an employee at Apple Computer, employee number 12, and one day I helped move materials out of this garage. At the time, Steve Jobs said the company was short of loot, so he offered to pay me in company shares, but I held out for the money. My mother still reminds me of that incident. The Apple I was even less of a computer than the Altair. A single circuit board that came with neither a case nor a keyboard. Still, Steve Jobs managed to sell 50 Apple I's. That experience showed Jobs that there was a market for a real computer, the Apple II.
It was very clear to me that while there were a bunch of hardware hobbyists that could assemble their own computers, or at least take our board and add the transformers for the power supply and the case and the keyboard and go get a, et cetera, go get the rest of the stuff. For every one of those, there were 1,000 people that couldn't do that but wanted to mess around with programming. Software hobbyists. Just like I had been when I was, 10, discovering that computer. And so my dream for the Apple II was to sell the first real packaged computer.
Steve Jobs' dream was impossible. It needed too many chips, making the product too complicated and expensive to build. But Woz didn't know it was impossible.
And then I got into a way of why have memory for your TV screen and memory for your computer, make them one. And that shrunk the chips down, and I shrunk the chips here, and why not take all these timing circuits? I looked through manuals and found a chip that did it in one chip instead of 5 and reduced that, and one thing after another happened. I wound up with so few chips. When I was done, I said, hey, a computer that you can program to generate colored patterns on a screen, or data, or words, or play games, or anything. And it was just the computer I wanted, for myself, pretty much. And but it had turned out so good. He said, I think we have a computer we could sell 1,000 a month of. I thought, how could you sell 1,000 a month,
but we needed some money for tooling the case and things like that. We needed a few $100,000.
That was a lot of money for two people who had nothing in their lives to speak of, didn't have a $400 bank account.
So I went looking for some venture capital.
The scruffy 19-year-old seduced the conservative world of venture capitalists. The man Jobs persuaded to part with his cash was Arthur Rock, the inventor of venture capital and the man who had originally funded Intel. At least the Intel boys had graduated from university and owned suits.
Well, he wore sandals, and he had very long hair and beard and mustache, but very articulate. He was, I think at one time in his life, and it was probably when I first met him, that he ate nothing but fruit.
So as a mainline venture capitalist, this
is not the norm. This is not the norm.
With money in hand and under occasional adult supervision from an ex-Intel manager named Mike Markkula, Woz and Jobs finished the Apple II and ordered a local factory to build 1,000 machines. 2 years passed between the Altair and the Apple II, and in that time a lot of things changed. We went from a computer that was designed for hobbyists and engineers and certainly looked like a piece of test equipment to a computer that looked like a piece of consumer electronics. And we can thank Steve Jobs for that. His sense of design demanded that this structural foam case be used for the Apple II, the first case of its type on a personal computer. And not that there wasn't good engineering inside either. The Apple II was a model of efficient engineering. Here's the floppy disk drive controller, for example. There are 8 chips here where previously there would have been 35. This is an amazing bit of engineering that we can attribute to Steve Wozniak, who was certainly the Mozart of digital design. And all told, it turned the Apple II into a sensation. The Apple II was launched at Jim Warren's West Coast Computer Fair, one of the first big microcomputer shows. The 1978 show drew thousands of attendees and dozens of exhibitors, many of them members of the Homebrew Computer Club, which spawned most of the early microcomputer companies. But there was only one company showing something that looked like a modern personal computer. Right by the entrance, in a prime spot negotiated by Steve Jobs, sat the Apple II. It mesmerized all who saw it.
My recollection is we stole the show. And a lot of dealers and distributors started lining up, and we were off and running.
How old were you?
21.
21?
Yeah.
Fire up the Chevy and drive out to the beach.
Following the West Coast Computer Fair, the next 2 years were ones of explosive growth for Apple, with thousands of customers arriving on the doorstep of the tiny office in Cupertino, California. Sales and profits grew so quickly that Apple had more money than the company could spend. And the company was very young. The founders were in their 20s, and some employees were even younger, like 14-year-old Chris Espinoza, who never left. He still works at Apple almost 20 years later.
There would be public demonstrations of our product every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock. And that was good because it was after school. So I would get out of my, sophomore, junior year of high school. I would ride my little moped down to the Apple offices, and at 3 o'clock I'd give the demonstrations of the Apple II.
When we were in the office, it was, hey, jokes and wiring up people's phones to do weird things, just every one of us. I mean, there wasn't a person in Apple, I don't think, for a couple of years that was, super serious. We were lucky. We had, like, the hot product of its day.
And some of the people that I did original demos to came up to me years later and said, I founded a $100 million chain of computer stores based on the demo you showed me one Tuesday afternoon at Apple. It's really fun.
It went so successful that all of a sudden, Steve and I wouldn't have to worry about work for the rest of our lives. And then it got even more successful and more successful after that. And it was sort of a shock.
The Apple II set a new standard for personal computers and showed there was some real money to be made. Rival companies popped up all over, but the market was still hobbyists, guys with big beards who thought a good use for their computer was controlling a model train set.
Loads in the actual program.
But for microcomputers to be taken seriously, they had to start doing things that needed doing, functions that were useful, not just for fun.
Over 2,000 programs with
The enthusiast market had its limits. To reach the rest of us, the Apple II needed what nerds call a killer application. Software that's so useful that people will buy computers just to run it. For the Apple II, this application was called VisiCalc. It came straight from the blackboards of the Harvard Business School. Invented by a graduate student, Dan Bricklin, with his programmer friend Bob Frankston, VisiCalc was the first electronic spreadsheet. A spreadsheet is a tool for financial planning, bringing together for the first time the seduction of money with the power of microcomputing. Dan Bricklin's professor at Harvard showed how companies used a grid of numbers on a blackboard to work out profits and expenses.
60 down here, and your profit would be this minus this, which gives you 40. And then, well, let's see, what's the sales growth? We'll say there's a 10%.
The trick to a spreadsheet is that all the values in the table are related to the others. So changes in one year would ripple through the table, affecting prices and profits in subsequent years. Students were asked to calculate how future profits would be affected by various business scenarios. It was called running the numbers, and they did it laboriously, by hand.
Well, let's say your initial costs have 100 fixed costs at the beginning, so now you have a minus 20 is how much you make the first year. And then the second year you have 100, but your variable, let's say, is 25. So now you're losing, what is it? There's a pain in the neck. I wasn't very good at this stuff. 80, what? No.
We failed. We just lost.
Minus 15, right? And then eventually you're making money. What year do we make money? And, and how much does the cost of money? That's what running the numbers was.
Because each value was linked to the others, one mistake could mean disaster.
Blows all your numbers afterwards because you make all your calculations based on other numbers before them. If I had miscalculated...
Dan, who had worked as a programmer, started daydreaming about how he could use a computer to replace the tedious hand calculations.
I imagined that there was this magic blackboard that did like word processing does word wrapping. If you make a change to a word, it automatically pulls everything back. Well, why not recalculate the same way? So that if I changed my number, I should have used 10% instead of 12%. I could just put it in and it would recalculate everything, go through it. And that would be this idea of electronic spreadsheet.
Following a model that's common today, Dan Bricklin designed the program, but got his friend Bob Frankston to write the actual computer code. After months of programming late at night, when computer time was cheaper, the Harvard Business School blackboard came to life.
Now we set this up, okay? Then we type a new value in, okay? Here I'm going to take that 100, and I'm going to change it, right? And here, recalculate it. Whoa! That saved me so much time.
People who saw it and went and got it, like an accountant, I remember showing it to one around here, and he started shaking and said, "That's what I do all week. I could do it in an hour. What I could do, and they would take their credit cards and shove them in your face. I meet these people now, they come up to me and say, I got to tell you, it's...
You changed my life.
Changed my life. You made accounting fun." And
you have to remember what it was like in those days. We did not use the word spreadsheet because nobody knew what a spreadsheet was. I came up with the name Visible Calculator, or VisiCalc, because you wanted to emphasize that aspect.
VisiCalc hit the market in October 1979, selling for $100. Marv Goldschmidt sold the first copies from his computer store in Bedford, Massachusetts. After a slow start, VisiCalc took off.
What it did in our society, it gave people who were obsessed with numbers, whether they're in business or at home, how much am I worth today? What's my stock portfolio worth? How am I doing against budget on this project? It gave them the ability to play with scenarios and change it and say, well, what if I do this? So put people, in a sense, in control of the thing that lots of people in our society feel is driving them, and that's numbers.
The spreadsheet was every businessman's crystal ball. It answered all those what-if questions. What if I fire the engineering department? What if I invest $10 million in pantyhose futures? Look, I'll be rich in under a year and have slimmer thighs at the same time. The computer says so.
$5 up 25!
The effect of the spreadsheet was enormous. Armed with an Apple II running VisiCalc, a 24-year-old MBA with 2 pieces of dubious data could convince his corporate managers to allow him to loot the corporate pension fund and do a leverage buyout. It was the perfect tool for the 80s, the me decade, when money was everything and greed was good.
The money seemed limitless.
Investments, cash flow.
The whiz kids, many fresh out of college, drawn here by the lure of big money.
Estimates.
He'd made millions for himself and others selling junk bonds.
Forecasts or plans.
A group that had been motivated by greed.
Calc can help you work faster.
In 5 years, the PC had gone from a hobbyist's toy to an engine that shaped the times we lived in. Thanks to VisiCalc, the Apple II made history.
Everybody you talked to just seemed excited about talking about what we were doing. And there was this huge media explosion, kind of like the internet is receiving today, of this is the happening thing. You read about it over and over and over, and every time you took an airplane flight, you read about it. And every newspaper, every week, you'd read something about small computers coming, and Apple was one of the highlight companies. So we were being portrayed as a leader of a revolution, and we really felt that we were a leader of a revolution. We were going to change life a lot.
Pretty good for a company started in a garage 3 years before. But not all the PC pioneers made great fortunes. Dan Bricklin decided not to patent his spreadsheet idea. Though more than 100 million spreadsheets have been sold since 1979, Bricklin and Frankston haven't earned VisiCalc royalties in years.
You know, looking back at how successful a lot of other people have been, it's kind of sad that we weren't as successful.
It would be very nice to be gazillionaires, but it can also understand that part of the reason was that that's not who we're trying to be.
We're kids of the 60s. And what did you want to do? You wanted to make the world better. And you wanted to make your mark on the world and improve things. And we did it. So by the mark of what we would measure ourselves by, we're very successful.
Yes.
And what about Ed Roberts? 3 years and 40,000 computers after assembling that first Altair, the fun was over for Ed. MITS was just another player in what had become a competitive market for personal computers. Roberts sold his company in 1978 and started a new life. He went back to his native Georgia and retrained as a doctor.
I hadn't really thought anything at all about it until the last few years when people started taking credit for things that we did at MITS. And that's the only thing I think about it. It irritates me, the things that we did at MITS and we took all the heat for, that other people have tried to take credit for. And that frustrates me.
While Ed Roberts invented the personal computer, it was the founders of Apple who got rich. When Apple went public in spectacular fashion in 1980, Jobs and Woz became multi-millionaires. The nerds had inherited the earth.
I was worth about over $1 million when I was 23, and over $10 million when I was 24, and over $100 million when I was 25. And it wasn't that important because I never did it for the money.
It was just a little hobby company like a lot of people do, not thinking anything of it. I mean, it wasn't like we both thought it was going to go a long ways. It was like, we'll both do it for fun. But back then, there was a short window in time where one person who could sit down and do some neat, good designs could turn them into a huge thing like the Apple II.
It's astonishing that at the beginning of 1975, nobody owned a personal computer. All there was a mock-up on a magazine cover. Yet within 5 years, there had emerged here in Silicon Valley a billion-dollar industry. An unhealthy fascination with technology on the part of a few adolescents had awakened the nerd within us all. PC companies were sprouting like mushrooms to meet the enormous demand. Apple had emerged as the top fungus and had taken 50% of the market. To the boys in Cupertino, every day seemed like Christmas. But Scrooge was around the corner. There was a company that everyone associated with the word computer, a company that expected, no, demanded to dominate its market, IBM. Big Blue was on the move, and Silicon Valley would soon be feeling the reverberations.
De omvang van de computerindustrie is vooral ook te danken aan de introductie van IBM op de PC-markt. De relatie tussen IBM en Microsoft, de enorme expansie, de IBM-clones en de opkomst van Windows. U ziet het in de tweede aflevering van de Willy Wortels van Silicon Valley. Volgende week woensdag tegen 8 uur.
In 1975 verschijnt de eerste PC, de Altair van Ed Roberts. Het apparaat is nauwelijks te gebruiken. Totdat de pas 19 jaar oude Bill Gates de eerste computertaal voor PC's ontwikkelt. Toch is er dan nog niemand echt geïnteresseerd. Maar dan komen Steve Jobs en Steve Wozniak met de eerste Apple-computer. Het wordt meteen een groot succes. In 1980 is de omzet van PC's in Amerika al gestegen tot meer dan $1 miljard. Hier pakken we de draad weer op.
We are nerds.
Most of the people in the industry were young because the guys who had any real experience were too smart to get involved in all these crazy little machines.
It really wasn't that we were going to build billion-dollar businesses. We were having a good time.
I thought this was the most fun you could possibly have with your clothes on.
When the personal computer was invented more than 20 years ago, it was just that, an invention. It wasn't a business. These were hobbyists who built these machines and wrote this software to have fun. But that has really changed. And now this is a business. This is a big business.
Power Center!
It just goes to show you that people can be bought. If you're really an exciting entrepreneur.
Thank you. I want to see a blue Laurel Motors. If you got that.
How the personal computer industry grew from 0 to 100 million units is an amazing story. And it wasn't just those early funky companies of nerds and hackers like Apple that made it happen. Most of this transformation from hobby to big business can be linked to 3 letters. IBM. IBM was and is an American business phenomenon. Over 60 years, Tom Watson and his son, Tom Jr., built what their workers called Big Blue into the top computer company in the world. But IBM made mainframe computers for large companies, not personal computers, at least not yet. For the PC to be taken seriously by big business, the nerds of Silicon Valley had to meet the suits of corporate America. IBM never fired anyone, requiring only undying loyalty to the company and a strict dress code. IBM hired conservative hard workers straight from school. Few IBMers were at the Summer of Love. Their turn-ons were giant mainframes and corporate responsibility. They worked 9 to 5 and on Saturdays washed the car. This is Intergalactic HQ for IBM, the largest computer company in the world. But in many ways, IBM is really more a country than it is a company. It has hundreds of thousands of citizens, it has a bureaucracy, it has an entire culture. Everything, in fact, but an army. Okay, Sam, we're ready to visit IBM country. Obviously, we're dressed for the part. Now, when you were in sales training in 1959 for IBM, did you sing company songs?
Absolutely.
Well, just to get us in the mood, let's sing one right here.
You're
I have
kidding.
the IBM, the songs of the IBM, and we're going to try for number 74, Our IBM Salesman, sung to the tune of Jingle Bells.
IBM, happy men smiling all the way. Oh, what fun it is to sell our products night and day. IBM, Watson men, partners of TJ. In his service to mankind, that's why we are so gay.
Now, gay didn't mean what it means today then. Remember that.
Right.
Okay?
Okay, let's go.
Okay. I guess it was okay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
When I started at IBM, there was a dress code. That was an informal oral code of white shirts. You couldn't wear anything but a white shirt, generally with a starch collar. I remember attending my first class, and a gentleman said to me as we were entering the building, "Are you an IBMer?" And I said, "Yes." He had a three-piece suit on, vests were of the Vogue, and he said, "Could you just lift your pants leg, please?" I said, "What?" And before I knew it, he had lifted my pants leg, and he said, "You're not wearing any garters." I said, "What?" He said, "Your socks, they're not pulled tight to the top. You need garters." And sure enough, I had to go get garters.
IBM is like Switzerland. Conservative, a little dull, yet prosperous. It has committees to verify each decision. The safety net is so big that it's hard to make a bad decision, or any decision at all.
At which we announced the new organizational structure.
Rich Seidner, computer programmer and wannabe Paul Simon, spent 25 years marching in step at IBM. He feels better now.
I mean, it's like getting 400,000 people to agree what they want to have for lunch. You know, I mean, it's just not going to happen. It's going to be lowest common, and, you know, it's going to be, you know, hot dogs and beans. So, so what are you going to do? So IBM had created this process, and it absolutely made sure that quality would be preserved throughout the process, that you actually were doing what you set out to do and what you thought the customer wanted. At one point, somebody kind of looked at the process to see, well, you know, what's it doing and what's the overhead built into it. And what they found is that it would take at least 9 months to ship an empty box.
By the late 70s, even IBM had begun to notice the explosive growth of personal computer companies like Apple.
The Apple II, small, inexpensive, simple to use. The first computer...
What's more, it was a computer business they didn't control. In 1980, IBM decided they wanted a piece of this action.
There were suddenly tens of thousands of people buying machines of that class, and they loved them, and they were very happy with them, and they were showing up in the engineering departments of our clients as machines that were brought in because you can't do the job on your mainframe kind of thing.
JB wanted to know why I'm doing better than all the other managers. It's no secret. I have an Apple. Sure, there's a big computer 3 flights down, but it won't test my options, do my charts, or edit my reports like my Apple.
People who'd gotten it were religious fanatics about them. So the concern was we were losing the hearts and minds. And give me a machine to win back the hearts and minds.
In business, as in comedy, timing is everything, and time looked like it might be running out for an IBM PC. I'm visiting the IBMer who took up the challenge. In August 1979, as IBM's top management met to discuss their PC crisis, Bill Lowe ran a small lab in Boca Raton, Florida.
Oh, hey, Bill, nice to see you again. Yeah, I tried to match the IBM dress code. How did I do?
That's terrific. That's terrific. I'm sorry.
He knew the company was in a quandary. Wait another year, and the PC industry would be too big even for IBM to take on. Chairman Frank Carey turned to the department heads and said, "Help!"
He kind of said, well, what should we do? And I said, well, we think we know what we would like to do if we were going to proceed with our own product. And he said, no. He said, at IBM it would take 4 years and 300 people to do anything. I mean, it's just a fact of life. And I said, no, sir, we can provide you a product in a year. And he abruptly ended the meeting. He said, you're on, Lowe. Come back in 2 weeks and tell me what you need.
An IBM product in a year? Ridiculous. Down in the basement, Bill still has the plan. To save time, instead of building a computer from scratch, they would buy components off the shelf and assemble them. What in IBM speak was called open architecture. IBM never did this. 2 weeks later, Bill proposed his heresy to the chairman.
And frankly, this is it. Now, the key decisions were to go with an open architecture. Non-IBM technology, non-IBM software, non-IBM sales, and non-IBM service. And we probably spent a full half of the presentation carrying the corporate management committee into this concept, because this was a new concept for IBM at that point in time.
Was it a hard sell?
Mr. Carey bought it, and as a result of him buying it, we got through it.
With the backing of the chairman, Bill and his team then set out to break all the IBM rules and go for a record.
We'll put it in the IBM section.
Once IBM had decided to do a personal computer, and to do it in a year, they couldn't really design anything. They just had to slap it together. So that's what we'll do. You have a central processing unit, and let's see. You need a monitor or display and a keyboard. Okay, a PC, except it's not. There's something missing. Time for the Cringely crash course in elementary computing. A PC is a box full of electronic switches, a piece of hardware. It's useless until you tell it what to do. It requires a program of instructions. That's software. Every PC requires at least 2 essential bits of software in order to work at all. First, it requires a computer language. That's what you type in to give instructions to the computer, to tell it what to do. Remember, it was a computer language called BASIC that Paul Allen and Bill Gates adapted to the Altair, the first PC. The other bit of software that's required is called an operating system. That's the internal traffic cop that tells the computer itself how the keyboard is connected to the screen or how to store files on a floppy disk instead of just losing them when you turn off the PC at the end of the day. Operating systems tend to have boring, unfriendly names like Unix and CPM and MS-DOS, but though they may be boring, it's an operating system that made Bill Gates the richest man in the world. And the story of how that came about is, well, pretty interesting. So the contest begins. Who would IBM buy their software from? Let's meet the 2 contenders. The late Gary Kildall, then age 39, a computer science PhD, and a 24-year-old Harvard dropout, Bill Gates. By the time IBM came calling in 1980, Bill Gates and his small company, Microsoft, was the biggest supplier of computer languages in the fledgling PC industry.
Many different computer manufacturers are making the CPM operating system standard on most models.
For their operating system, though, the logical guy for the IBMers to see was Gary Kildall. He ran a company modestly called Intergalactic Digital Research. Gary had invented the PC's first operating system, called CPM. He'd already sold 600,000 of them, so he was the big cheese of operating systems.
In the early 70s, I had a need for an operating system myself, and it just was a very natural thing to write, and it turns out other people had a need for an operating system like that. And so it was a very natural thing. I wrote it for my own use, and then started selling it.
In Gary's mind, it was the dominant thing, and it would always be the dominant because, you know, Bill did languages and Gary did operating systems. And he really honestly believed that would never change.
But what would change the balance of power in this young industry was the characters of the 2 protagonists.
So I knew Gary back when he was an assistant professor at Monterey Post Grad School, and I was simply a grad student. And went down, sat in his hot tub, smoked dope with him, and thoroughly enjoyed it all, and commiserated and talked nerd stuff. He liked playing with gadgets, just like Woz did and does, just like I did and do.
He wasn't really interested in how you drive the business. He worked on projects, things that interest him.
He didn't go rushing off to the patent office and patent CPM and patent every line of code he could. He didn't try to just squeeze the last dollar out of it.
Gary was not a fighter. Gary avoided conflict. Gary hated conflict. Bill, I don't think anyone could say, backed away from conflict.
Nobody said future billionaires have to be nice guys. Here at the Microsoft Museum is a shrine to Bill's legacy. Bill Gates hardly fought his way up from the gutter. Raised in a prosperous Seattle household, his mother was a homemaker who did charity work, his father a successful lawyer. But beneath the affluence and comfort of a perfect American family, a competitive spirit ran deep.
I ended up spending the Memorial Day weekend with him out on his grandmother's house on Hood Canal. She turned everything into a game. It was a very, very, very competitive environment. And if you spent the weekend there,
you were part of the competition, and it didn't matter whether it was hearts or pickleball or swimming to the dock, or, you know, and there was always a reward for winning, and there was always a penalty for losing.
One time was funny. I went to Bill's house, and he really wanted to show me his jigsaw puzzle that he was working on. And he really wanted to talk about how, like, he did this jigsaw puzzle in, like, 4 minutes. And, like, on the box, it says, if you're a genius, then you would do the jigsaw puzzle in, like, 7. And he was into it. He's like, you know, I can do it. And I said, no, you know, I believe you. You don't need to break it up and do it for me. No.
Bill Gates can be so focused that the small things in life get overlooked.
If he was busy, he didn't bathe. He didn't change clothes. We were in New York, and the demo that we had crashed the evening before the announcement, and Bill worked all night with some other engineers to fix it. Well, it didn't occur to him to take 10 minutes for a shower after that. Just didn't occur to him that that was important. And he badly needed a shower that day.
The scene is set. In California, laid-back Gary Kildall, already making the best-selling PC operating system, CP/M. In Seattle, Bill Gates, maker of BASIC, the best-selling PC language, but always prepared to seize an opportunity. So IBM had to choose one of these guys to write the operating system for its new personal computer. One would hit the jackpot. The other would be forgotten, a footnote in the history of the personal computer. And it all starts with a telephone call to an 8th floor office in that building, the headquarters of Microsoft, in 1980.
At about noon, I guess, I called Bill Gates on Monday and said I would like to come out and talk to him about his products.
Bill said, well, how's next week? And they said, we're on an airplane, we're leaving in an hour, we'd like to be there tomorrow. Well, hallelujah, right on.
Steve Ballmer was a Harvard roommate of Gates. He had just joined Microsoft and would end up its 3rd billionaire. Back then, he was the only guy in the company with business training. Both Ballmer and Gates instantly saw the importance of the IBM visit.
And Bill said, Steve, you better come to the meeting. You're the only other guy here who can wear a suit. So we figured, okay, the two of us will put on suits, we'll put on suits, and we'll go to this meeting.
We got there roughly 2 o'clock. And we were waiting in the front, and this young fellow came out to take us back to Mr. Gates' office. I thought he was the office boy. And of course, it was Bill. He was quite decisive. We popped out the non-disclosure agreement, the letter that said that he wouldn't tell anybody we were there and that we wouldn't hear any secrets and so forth. He signed it immediately.
IBM didn't make it easy. You had to sign all these funny agreements that sort of said IBM could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and use your secrets however they felt. But so it took a little bit of faith.
Jack Sams was looking for a package from Microsoft containing both the BASIC computer language and an operating system. But IBM hadn't done their homework.
They thought we had an operating system. Because we had this soft card product that had CP/M on it, they thought we could license some CP/M for this new personal computer they told us they wanted to do. And we said, well, no, we're not in that business. And
when we discovered we didn't have he didn't have the rights to do that, and that it was not, he said, but I think it's ready. I think Gary's got it ready to go. I said, well, no time like the present, call up Gary.
So Bill, right there with them in the room, called Gary Kildall, Digital Research, said, Gary, I'm sending some guys down. They're going to be on the phone. Treat them right. They're important guys.
The men from IBM came to this Victorian house in Pacific Grove, California, headquarters of Digital Research, headed by Gary and Dorothy Kildall. Just imagine what it's like having IBM come to visit. It's like having the Queen drop by for tea. It's like having the Pope come by looking for advice. It's like a visit from God himself. And what did Gary and Dorothy do? They sent them away.
Gary had some other plans, and so he said, well, Dorothy will see you. And so we went down, the 3 of us.
IBM showed up with an IBM non-disclosure, and Dorothy made a decision which I think it's easy in retrospect to say was dumb.
Well, we popped out our letter that said, please don't tell anybody we're here, and we don't want to hear anything confidential. And she read it, and she said, I can't sign this.
She did what her job was. She got the lawyer to look at the non-disclosure. The lawyer, Jerry Davis, who's still in Monterey, threw up on this non-disclosure. It was uncomfortable for IBM. They weren't used to being waiting, and And it was an unfortunate situation. Here you are in a tiny Victorian house that's overrun with people and chaotic. And
so we spent the whole day in Pacific Grove debating with them and with our attorneys and her attorneys and everybody else about whether or not she could even talk to us about talking to us. And we left.
This is the moment digital research dropped the ball. IBM, distinctly unimpressed with their reception, went back to Microsoft. Bill Gates isn't the man to give a rival a second chance. He saw the opportunity of a lifetime.
Digital research didn't seize that, and we knew it was essential. If somebody didn't do it, the project was going to fall apart. So
we just got carried away and said, look, we can't afford to lose the language business. That was the initial thought. We can't afford to have IBM not go forward. This is the most exciting thing that's going to happen in PCs.
And we were already out on the limb because we had licensed them not only BASIC, but Fortran, COBOL, Assembler, Typing Tutor, Adventure. And basically every product the company had, we had committed to do for IBM in a very short time frame.
But there was a problem. IBM needed an operating system fast, and Microsoft didn't have one. What they did have was a stroke of luck, the ingredient everyone needs to be a billionaire. Unbelievably, the solution was just across town. Paul Allen, Gates' programming partner since high school, had found another operating system.
There's a local company here in Seattle called Seattle Computer Products, a guy named Tim Patterson, and he had done an operating system, very rudimentary operating system that was kind of like CP/M.
And we just told IBM, look, we'll go get this operating system from the small local company, we'll take care of it, we'll fix it up, and you can still do a PC.
Tim Patterson's operating system, which saved the deal with IBM, was, well, adapted from Gary Kildall's CP/M.
So I took a CP/M manual that I'd gotten from the retail computer store, $5 in 1976 or something, and used that as the basis for the application programming interface, the API for my operating system. And so using these ideas that came from different places, I started in April, and it was about half time for 4 months before I had my first working version.
This is it. The operating system Tim Patterson wrote. He called it QDOS, the quick and dirty operating system. Microsoft and IBM called it PC-DOS 1.0. And under any name, it looks an awful lot like CP/M. On this computer here, I have running a PC-DOS and CP/M86, and frankly, it's very hard to tell the difference between the two. The command structures are the same, so are the directories. In fact, the only obvious external difference is the floppy drive is labeled A in PC-DOS and C in CP/M. Some difference, and yet one generated billions in revenue and the other disappeared. As usual in the PC business, the prize didn't go to the inventor, but to the exploiter of the invention. In this case, that wasn't Gary Kildall. It wasn't even Tim Patterson. There was still one problem. Tim Patterson worked for Seattle Computer Products, or SCP. They still owned the rights to QDOS, rights that Microsoft had to have.
But then we went back and said to them, look, you know, we want to buy this thing. And SCP was, like most little companies, they, you know, always needed cash, and so that was when they went into the negotiation.
And so ended up working out a deal to buy the operating system from him for whatever usage we wanted for $50,000.
Hey, let's pause there to savor an historic moment.
For whatever usage we wanted for $50,000.
It had to be the deal of the century, if not the millennium. It was certainly the deal that made Bill Gates and Paul Allen multi-billionaires and allowed Paul Allen to buy toys like these, his own NBA basketball team and arena. Microsoft bought outright for $50,000 the operating system they needed, and they turned around and licensed it to the world for up to $50 per PC. Think of it, 100 million personal computers running MS-DOS software funneling billions into Microsoft, a company that back then was 50 kids managed by a 25-year-old who needed to wash his hair. Nice work if you can get it, and Microsoft got it.
There are no two places further apart in the USA than southeastern Florida and Washington State, where Microsoft is based. This is Florida, Boca Raton, and this building right here is where the IBM PC was developed.
Here, the nerds from Seattle joined forces with the suits of corporate America. And in that first honeymoon year, they pulled off a fantastic achievement.
After we got a package in the mail from the people down in Florida.
As August 1981 approached, the deadline for the launch of the IBM Acorn, the PC industry held its breath.
Supposedly, maybe at this very moment, IBM is announcing their personal computer. We don't know that yet.
In companies across America, software writers like Dan Bricklin, the creator of the first spreadsheet, waited with his staff for news of the announcement. This is a moment of PC history. IBM secrecy had codenamed the PC the Floridian Project. Everyone in the PC business knew IBM would change their world forever. They also knew that if their software was on the IBM PC, they would make fortunes.
Note that the attached information is not to be disclosed prior to any public announcement. It's on the ticker. It's on the ticker? Okay, so now you can tell people.
What we're watching are the first few seconds of a $100 billion industry.
After years of thinking big, today IBM came up with something small.
Computer. Big Blue is looking for a slice of Apple's market share. IBM
Like bits and bytes mean nothing, try this word. Money.
Now they're going to sell $1,000 computers to millions of customers.
A piece of the pie. I have seen the future, said one analyst, and it computes.
Today, an IBM computer has reached a personal stage.
Nobody was ever fired for buying IBM. Now companies could put PCs with a name they trusted on desks from Wall's End to Wall Street.
What IBM said was, it's okay, corporate America, for you to now start buying and using PCs. And if it's okay for corporate America, it's got to be okay for everybody.
Your own IBM personal computer.
For all the hype, the IBM PC wasn't much better than what came before. So while the IBM name could create immense demand, it took a killer application to sustain it. The killer app for the IBM PC was yet another spreadsheet. Based on VisiCalc, but called Lotus 123, its creators were the first of many to get rich on IBM's success. Within a year, Lotus was worth $150 million. Wham, bam, thank you, IBM.
Time to rock! Time for fun! Yeah, they're working.
IBM had forecast sales of 500,000 computers by 1984. In those 3 years, they sold 2 million.
Yeah!
Euphoric, I guess is the right word. Everybody was, believed that they were not going to, at that point, 2 million or 3 million, you know, they were now thinking in terms of 100 million. I mean, they were probably off the scale in the other direction.
What did all this mean to Bill Gates, whose operating system, DOS, was at the heart of every IBM PC sold? Initially, not much because of the deal with IBM, but it did give him a vital bridgehead to other players in the PC marketplace, which meant trouble in the long run for Big Blue.
The key to the structure of our deal was that IBM had no control over our licensing to other people. And the lesson of the computer industry in mainframes was that over time people built compatible machines or clones, whatever term you want to use. And so really the primary upside on the deal we have with IBM, because they had a fixed fee, we got about $80,000, and we got some other money for some special work we did, but no royalty from them. And that's the DOS in BASIC as well. And so we were hoping a lot of other people would come along and do compatible machines.
There were other PCs that were sort of like the IBM PC, kind of like it, but IBM now had 50% market share and was defining what a PC meant. What the public wanted was IBM PCs. So to be successful, other manufacturers would have to build computers exactly like the IBM.
They wanted to copy the IBM PC, to clone it. How could they do that legally? Well, welcome to the world of reverse engineering.
This is what reverse engineering can get you if you do it right.
Well, the thing about Texas...
It's the modest Aspen, Colorado ski shack of Rod Canyon, one of the founders of Compaq,
the company set up to compete head-on with the IBM PC. Back in 1982, Rod and 3 fellow engineers from Texas Instruments sketched out a computer design on a placemat at the House of Pies restaurant in Houston, Texas. They decided to manufacture and market a portable version of the IBM PC using the curious technique of reverse engineering.
Reverse engineering is figuring out, after something's already been created, how it ticks, what makes it work, usually for the purpose of creating something that works the same way, or at least does something like the thing you're trying to reverse engineer.
Here's how you clone a PC. IBM had made it easy to copy. The microprocessor was available off the shelf from Intel, and the other parts came from many sources. Only one part was IBM's alone, a vital chip that connected the hardware with the software. Called the ROM BIOS, this was IBM's own design, protected by copyright and by Big Blue's army of lawyers. Compaq had to somehow copy the chip without breaking the law.
First, you have to decide how the ROM works. So what we had to do is have an engineer sit down with that code and through trial and error write a specification that said, here's how the BIOS ROM needs to work. It couldn't be close, it had to be exact. So there was a lot of detail testing that went on.
You test how that all-important chip behaves and make a list of what it has to do. Now it's time to meet my lawyer, Claude.
I've examined the internals of the ROM BIOS and written this book of specifications. Now I need some help because I've done as much as I can do, and you need to explain what's next.
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the book of specifications myself, but the first thing I can tell you, Robert, is that you're out of it now. You are contaminated. You are dirty. You've seen the product that's the original work of authorship. You've seen the target product. So now, from here on in, we're going to be working with people who are not dirty. We're going to be working with so-called virgins who are going to be operating in the clean room.
I certainly don't qualify there.
Yeah, I imagine you don't. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to hire a group of engineers who have never seen the IBM ROM BIOS. They have never seen it, they've never operated it, they know nothing about it. Have you ever before attempted to disassemble, decompile, or to in any way, shape, or form reverse engineer any IBM equipment?
Oh, no.
Have you ever tried to disassemble or...
This is the Silicon Valley virginity test, and good virgins are hard to find.
You understand that in the event that we discover that the information you're providing us is inaccurate, you're subject to discipline by the company, and that can include but not be limited to termination immediately. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
After the virgins are deemed intact, they are forbidden contact with the outside world while they build a new chip, one that behaves exactly like the one in the specification. In Compaq's case, it took 15 senior programmers several months and cost $1 million to do the reverse engineering. In November 1982, Rod Canyon unveiled the result.
What I've brought today is a compact portable computer.
When Bill Murto, another Compaq founder, got a plug on a cable TV show, their selling point was clear: 100% IBM compatibility.
It turns out that all major and popular software runs on the IBM personal computer or the Compaq portable computer.
That extends through all of the software for IBM.
Yes.
It all works on the Compaq.
Compaq was an instant hit. In their first year, on the strength of being exactly like IBM, but a little cheaper, they sold 47,000 PCs.
In our first year of sales, we set an American business record, I guess maybe a world business record. Our largest first-year sales in history was $111 million.
So Rod Canyon ends up in Aspen, famous for having the most expensive real estate in America. And I try not to look envious while Rod tells me which executive jet he plans to buy next.
And finally he picked the Lear 31.
Oh, really?
Now that was a fun airplane.
Oh, yeah.
Poor Big Blue. Suddenly, everybody was cashing in on IBM's success. The most obvious winner at first was Intel, maker of the PC's microprocessor chip. Intel was selling chips like hotcakes to clone makers and making them smaller, quicker, and cheaper. This was unheard of. What kind of an industry had Big Blue gotten themselves into?
Things get less expensive every year. People aren't used to that in general. I mean, you buy a new car, you buy one now, 4 years later, go buy one, it costs more than the one you bought before. Here's this magical piece of an industry. You go buy one later, it costs less. And it does more. What a wonderful thing. But it causes some funny things to occur when you think about an industry. an industry where prices are coming down, where you have to sell it and use it right now, because if you wait later, it's worth less.
Where Compaq led, others soon followed. IBM was now facing dozens of rivals. Soon-to-be familiar names began to appear, like Amstrad, AST, and Dell. It was getting spectacularly easy to build a clone. You could get everything off the shelf, including a guaranteed virgin ROM BIOS chip. Each new clone maker, free of IBM's big overhead, took another bite out of Big Blue's business.
Well, they really hit with a vengeance in '85. The prices were going down on the competitive products at about 30% every 6 months. Terror would be a good, a good phrase.
Terror?
Oh, of course. I mean, it was getting. I mean, we were able to sell a lot of products, but it was getting difficult to make money.
And where did every clone maker buy his operating system? Microsoft, of course. By the mid-'80s, it was boom time for Bill. The teenage entrepreneur had predicted a PC on every desk and in every home running Microsoft software. It was actually coming true.
As Microsoft mushroomed, there was no way that Bill Gates could personally dominate thousands of employees. But that didn't stop him. He still had a need to be both industry titan and top programmer. So he had to come up with a whole new corporate culture for Microsoft. He had to find a way to satisfy both his adolescent need to dominate and his adult need to inspire.
From the beginning, Microsoft recruited straight out of college. They chose people who had no experience of life in other companies. In time, they'd be called microserfs.
And so a lot of young, I say people, but mostly it was young men who just were out of school, saw him as this incredible role model or leader, almost a guru, I guess. And they could sit and spend hours with him, and he valued their contributions, and there was just a wonderful camaraderie that seemed to exist between all these young men and Bill. And the strength that he has and his will and his desire to be the best and to be the winner, and he is just like a cult leader, really.
As the frenzied 80s came to a close, IBM reached a watershed. They had created an open PC architecture that anyone could copy. This was intentional, but IBM always thought their inside track would keep them ahead. Wrong. IBM's glacial pace and high overhead put them at a disadvantage to the leaner clone makers. Everything was turning into a nightmare as IBM lost its dominant market share. So in a big gamble, they staked their PC future to a new system, a new line of computers with proprietary closed hardware and their very own operating system.
It was war.
Start planning for Operating System 2 today.
IBM planned to steal the market from Gates with a brand new operating system called, drumroll please, OS2. IBM would design OS2, yet they asked Microsoft to write the code. Why would Microsoft help create what was intended to be the instrument of their own destruction? Because Microsoft knew IBM was the source of their success, and they would tolerate almost anything to stay close to Big Blue.
It was just part of, as we used to call it at the time, riding the bear. You just had to try to stay on the bear's back, and the bear would twist and turn and try to buck you and throw you, but darn, we were going to ride the bear because the bear was the biggest, the most important. You just had to be with the bear. Otherwise, you would be under the bear in the computer industry, and IBM was the bear, and we were going to ride the back of the bear.
But it's easy for people to forget how pervasive IBM's influence over this industry was. When you talk to people who've come into the industry recently, there's no way you can get that into their head. That was the environment.
The relationship between IBM and Microsoft was always a culture clash. IBMers were buttoned-up organization men. Microsofties were obsessive hackers. With the development of OS2, the strains really began to show.
In IBM, there's a religion in software that says you have to count K-locks, and a K-lock is 1,000 line of code. How big a project is it? Oh, it's a 10 K-lock project. This is a 20 K-locker, and there's a 50 K-locks. And IBM wanted to sort of make it the religion about how we got paid, how much money we made off OS2, how much they did. How many K-locks did you do? And we kept trying to convince them, hey, if we have developer's got a good idea, and he can get something done in 4K locks instead of 20K locks. Should we make less money? Because he's made something smaller and faster, less clocks. Oh, K-locks, that's the methodology. Yeah, anyway, it almost makes my back just crinkle up at the thought of the whole thing.
When I took over in '89, there was an enormous amount of resources working on OS/2, both in Microsoft and the IBM company. Bill Gates and I met on that several times. And we pretty quickly came to the conclusion together that that was not going to be a success the way it was being managed. It was also pretty clear that the negotiations and the contracts had given most of that control to Microsoft's.
It was no longer just a question of styles. There was now a clear conflict of business interest. OS/2 was planned to undermine the clone market, where DOS was still Microsoft's major moneymaker. Microsoft was DOS, but Microsoft was helping develop the opposition? Bad idea. To keep DOS competitive, Gates had been pouring resources into a new program called Windows. It was designed to provide a nice, user-friendly facade to boring old DOS. Selling it was another job for shy, retiring Steve Ballmer.
How much do you think this advanced operating environment is worth? Wait just 1 minute before you answer. Watch as Windows integrates Lotus 123 with Miami Vice. Now we can take this for...
Just as Bill Gates saw OS/2 as a threat, IBM regarded Windows as another attempt by Microsoft to hold on to the operating system business.
We created Windows in parallel. We kept saying to IBM, hey, Windows is the way to go, graphics is the way to go. And we got virtually everyone else enthused about Windows. So that was a divergence that we kept thinking we could get IBM to come around on.
It was clear that IBM had a different vision of its relationship with Microsoft than Microsoft had of its vision with IBM. Is that Microsoft's fault? You know, maybe some, but IBM's not blameless there either. So I don't view any of that as anything but just poor business on IBM's part.
Bill Gates is a very disciplined guy. He puts aside everything he wants to read and twice a year goes away for secluded reading weeks. The decisive moment in the Microsoft-IBM relationship came during just such a retreat. In front of a log fire, Bill concluded that it was no longer in Microsoft's long-term interest to blindly follow IBM. If Bill had to choose between OS/2, IBM's new operating system, and Windows, he'd choose Windows.
We said, ooh, IBM's probably not going to like this. This is going to threaten OS/2. Now, we told them about it. Right away, we told them about it. But we still did it. They didn't like it. We told them about it. We told them about it. We offered to license it to them.
We always thought the best thing to do is to try and combine IBM promoting the software with us doing the engineering. And so it was only when they broke off communication and decided to go their own way that we thought, okay, we're on our own. And that was definitely very, very scary.
And we were in a major negotiation in early 1990, right before the Windows launch. We wanted to have IBM on stage with us to launch Windows 3.0, but they wouldn't do the kind of deal that would allow us to profit. It would allow them essentially to take over Windows from us, and we walked away from the deal.
Switch to CD-ROM.
Jack Sams, who started IBM's relationship with Microsoft with that first call to Bill Gates in 1980, could only look on as the partnership disintegrated.
Then they, at that point, I think they agreed to disagree on the future progress of OS/2 and Windows. And internally, we were told, thou shalt not ship any more products on Windows. And about that time, I got the opportunity to take early retirement, so I did.
Bill's decision by the fireplace ended the 10-year IBM-Microsoft partnership and turned IBM into an also-ran in the PC business. Did David beat Goliath? The Boca Raton, Florida birthplace of the IBM PC is deserted, a casualty of diminishing market share. Today, IBM is again what it was before, a profitable, dominant mainframe computer company. For a while, IBM dominated the PC market. They legitimized the PC business, created the standards most of us now use, and introduced the PC to the corporate world. But in the end, they lost out. Maybe it was to a faster, more flexible business culture. Or maybe they just threw it away. That's the view of a guy who's been competing with IBM for 20 years, Silicon Valley's most outspoken software billionaire, Larry Ellison.
I think IBM made the single worst mistake in the history of enterprise on Earth.
Which was?
Which was the manufacturer, being the first manufacturer and distributor of the Microsoft Intel PC, which they mistakenly called the IBM PC. I mean, they were the first manufacturer and distributor of that technology. I mean, it's just simply astounding that they could basically give a third of their market value to Intel and a third of their market value to Microsoft by accident. I mean, no one, those two companies today are worth close to, approaching $100 billion. I mean, not many of us get a chance to make a $100 billion mistake.
As fast as IBM abandons its buildings, Microsoft builds new ones. In 1980, IBM was 3,000 times the size of Microsoft. Though still a smaller company, today Wall Street says Microsoft is worth more. Both have faced antitrust investigations about their monopoly positions. For years, IBM defined successful American corporate culture as a machine of ordered bureaucracy. Here in the corridors of Microsoft, it's a different style. It's personal. This company, in its drive, its hunger to succeed, is a reflection of one man, its founder, Bill Gates.
Bill wanted to win. Incredible desire to win and to beat other people. At Microsoft, the whole idea was that we would put people under, and unfortunately, that's happened a lot.
Bill Gates is special. You wouldn't have had a Microsoft with, take a random other person like Gary Kildall. On the other hand, Bill Gates was also lucky. But Bill Gates knows that, unlike a lot of other people in the industry, and he's paranoid. Every morning he gets up and he doesn't feel secure, he feels nervous about this. They're trying hard, they're not relaxing, and that's why they're so successful.
And I remember I was talking to Bill once, and I asked him what he feared. And he said that he feared growing old because, once you're beyond 30, this was his belief at the time, once you're beyond 30, you don't have as many good ideas anymore. It's like you're not as smart anymore.
If you just slow down a little bit, who knows who it'll be? Probably some company that may not even exist yet, but someone else can come in and take the lead.
I said, well, you're going to age, it's going to happen, it's kind of inevitable. Well, what are you going to do about it? And he said, I'm just going to hire the smartest people, and I'm just going to surround myself with all these smart people, And I thought that was kind of interesting. It was like he was like, oh, I can't be immortal, but like maybe this is the second best, and I can buy that,
If you miss what's happening, then the same kind of thing that happened to IBM or many other companies could happen to Microsoft very easily. So no one's got a guaranteed position in the high technology business. And the more you think about, how could we move faster? What could we do better? Are there good ideas out there that we should be going beyond? It's important. And I wouldn't trade places with anyone, but the reason I like my job so much is we have to constantly stay on top of those things.
The Windows software system that ended the alliance between Microsoft and IBM pushed Gates past all his rivals. Microsoft had been working on the software for years, but it wasn't until 1990 that they finally came up with a version that not only worked properly, it blew their rivals away. And where did the idea for this software come from? Well, not from Microsoft, of course.
It came from the hippies at Apple. Lights, camera, boot up. In 1984, they made a famous TV commercial. Apple had set out to create the first user-friendly PC, just as IBM and Microsoft were starting to make a machine for businesses. When the TV commercial aired, Apple launched the Macintosh.
Secure from the pests of a contradictory.
The computer and the commercial were aimed directly at IBM, which the kids in Cupertino thought of as Big Brother. But Apple had targeted the wrong people. It wasn't Big Brother they should have been worrying about. It was Big Bill Gates.
Shall talk themselves to death, but we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
Volgende week het derde deel van de Willy Wortels van Silicon Valley. Bill Gates introduceert Windows 95.
We wanted people to be able to appreciate how Windows 95 makes computing faster, easier and more fun.
Het was de omvangrijkste lancering van een product ooit, met satellietverbindingen en een spektakelshow. Aan het woord komen verder Apple-guru Steve Jobs en medeoprichter Steve Wozniak. De tovenaarsleerling, aflevering 3 van de Willy Wortels van Silicon Valley. Volgende week woensdag om 8 uur.
Let's go get 'em.
PC's zijn nog steeds lastig om te bedienen. Er is een revolutie nodig om ze gebruikersvriendelijk te maken. Daar gaat deze aflevering over.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of Windows 95.
Yes, well, welcome, Microsofties. Nice to have you all here. But now let's welcome the chairman of Microsoft. Listen to this. This is a man so successful, his chauffeur is Ross Perot, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome Bill Gates.
It's August 24th, 1995, in a suburb of Seattle in the Pacific Northwest. This is the biggest, noisiest product launch in the history of the personal computer. It's Windows 95 software, and Bill Gates is the star, chairman, chief nerd, and spiritual leader of Microsoft.
But the truth is,
This is the latest step in Bill's dream to have his software running on every PC in the world.
we wanted people to be able to appreciate how Windows 95 makes computing faster, easier, and more fun. And for 7 years, it was a lonely, lonely crusade.
Reality police.
This moves the whole PC industry up to a whole new level.
Wait a minute. All this publicity is so Bill Gates can claim that Windows 95 is the latest and perhaps most significant improvement in the PC since it was invented. He can say that his new operating system makes PCs nicer to look at and easier to use than ever before. They'll no longer be just for geeks and nerds. They'll be so easy to use that even my mother will want one. But you know what? Most of the ideas in Windows 95 were invented 20 years ago.
The 20-year journey to this software celebration hasn't been easy. It has involved huge gambles, passionate commitment, dramatic setbacks, and required the occasional crushing of rivals and allies. It's the triumph of Bill Gates' commercial vision. Success in the marketplace doesn't have to come from innovation or from being the best if you have a ruthless ability to exploit your opportunities. And the way Microsoft made the PC's graphical user interface its own is a textbook example of that ability.
Time for another cringely crash course in elementary computing. In the early days of personal computing, the machines were pretty hard to use. In part, that's because they were primitive, but it's also because computer guys tend to like things that are pretty hard to use. This is an IBM PC circa about 1983, and on it, I've written a letter to my bank manager asking him to back one of my get-rich-quick schemes. I need to file the letter now, and let me show you how I do it. There will be a test on this. Okay, the commands are copy C:\\, quick-rich.doc space A:\, begging and return. Well, not very easy to do. Here's a Windows PC about 12 years newer, and we'll do exactly the same thing. I've written a document, quick-rich.doc, and I put it in the begging file, and yes, I really do mean to do it, and that's it. Pictures rather than words, making the PC easy and intuitive. This is called a graphical user interface, GUI or GUI. Where they come up with these names. The battle to bring GUIs to PCs and make them more user-friendly took 10 years and is a hell of a story. That's what this program is about. It's also about how Bill Gates ended up master of the GUI universe and a gazillionaire. I never said it was a fairy story.
It all began in 1971 in Palo Alto, just south of San Francisco, when Xerox, the copier company, set up the Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC. Xerox management had a sinking feeling that if people started reading computer screens instead of paper, Xerox was in trouble. Unless they could dominate the paperless office of the future.
You could take computer technology into the office and make the office a much better place to work. More productive, more enjoyable, a lot more enjoyable, more interesting, more rewarding. And so we set to work on it.
Bob Taylor ran PARC's computer science lab, and one of the first things he did was to buy beanbags for his researchers to sit on and brainstorm.
These are a couple of the original beanbag chairs. The role of the beanbag chair in computer science is ease of use.
Okay.
It was said that of the top 100 computer researchers in the world, 58 worked at PARC. Strange, as the staff never exceeded 50.
You didn't get your butt low enough.
But Taylor gave these nerd geniuses unlimited resources and protected them from commercial pressures.
It's very comfortable.
Now let's see you get out of it.
I feel my neural capacity already increasing.
There you go.
Oh, God.
The atmosphere at PARC was electric. There was total intellectual freedom. There was no conventional wisdom. Almost every idea was up for challenge and got challenged regularly.
The management said, go create the new world. We don't understand it. Here are people who have a lot of ideas and tremendous talent, young, energetic.
People came there specifically to work on 5-year programs that were their dreams.
This is the computer room in the basement of the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. About 25 years ago, they built the Max time-sharing system in here, and now it's loaded with all sorts of other computers. And there's one that we're really interested in here. Let's see. Here it is. Let me turn on the lights. Okay, here we have it. This is a Xerox Alto computer built around 1973. Some people would argue that this is the first personal computer. It really isn't, because for one thing, it wasn't ever for sale, and the parts alone cost about $10,000. But it has all the elements of quite a modern personal computer, and without it, we wouldn't have the Macintosh, we wouldn't have Windows, we wouldn't have most of the things we value in computing today. And ironically, none of those things has a Xerox name on it.
What's the mail this morning?
This promotional film, made in the mid-70s to flaunt Xerox PARC research, shows just how revolutionary the Alto was. It was friendly and intuitive.
This is an experimental office system. It's in use now.
It had the first GUI using a mouse to point to information on the screen. It was linked to other PCs by a system called Ethernet, the first computer network. And what you saw on the screen was precisely what you got on your laser printer. It was way ahead of its time.
Thank you, Fred. Everybody wanted to make a real difference. We really thought we were changing the world, and that at the end of this project, or the set of projects, personal computing would burst on the scene exactly the way we had envisioned it and take everybody by total surprise.
But the brilliant researchers at PARC could never persuade Xerox management that their vision was accurate. Head office in New York ignored the revolutionary technologies they owned 3,000 miles away. They just didn't get it.
And none of the main body of the company was prepared to accept the answers. So there was a tremendous mismatch between the management and what the researchers were doing, in that these guys had never fantasized about what the future of the office was going to be, and when it was presented to them, they had no mechanisms for turning those ideas into real-life products. And that was really the frustrating part of it, because you were talking to people who didn't understand the vision. And yet the vision was getting created every day within the Palo Alto Research Center, and there was no one to receive that vision.
But a few miles down the road from Palo Alto was a man ready to share the vision.
The most dangerous man in Silicon Valley sits in an office in this building. People love him and hate him, often at the same time. For 10 years, by sheer force of will, he made the personal computer industry follow his direction. With this guy, we're not talking about someone driven by the profit motive and a desire for an opulent retirement at the age of 40. No, we're talking holy war. We're talking rivers of blood and fields of dead martyrs to the cause of greater computing. We're talking about a guy who sees the personal computer as his tool for changing the world. We're talking about Steve Jobs.
Hi, I'm Steve Jobs.
When I wasn't sure what the word charisma meant, I met Steve Jobs, and then I knew.
Steve Jobs is on my eternal heroes list. There's nothing he can ever do to get off it.
He wanted you to be great. And he wanted you to create something that was great. And he was going to make you do that.
He's also obnoxious. And this comes from his high standards. He has extremely high standards, and he has no patience with people who don't either share those standards or perform to them.
And I'm also one of these people that I don't really care about being right, you know. I just care about success.
Steve Jobs had co-founded Apple Computer in 1976. The first popular personal computer, the Apple II, was a hit and made Steve Jobs one of the biggest names in a brand new industry. At the height of Apple's early success, in December 1979, Jobs, then all of 24, had a privileged invitation to visit Xerox PARC.
And they showed me really three things. But I was so blinded by the first one that I didn't even really see the other two. One of the things they showed me was object-oriented programming. They showed me that, but I didn't even see that. The other one they showed me was really a networked computer system. They had over 100 Alto computers, all networked, using email, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't even see that. I was so blinded by the first thing they showed me, which was the graphical user interface. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever seen in my life. Now, remember, it was very flawed. What we saw was incomplete. They'd done a bunch of things wrong, but we didn't know that at the time. It's still, though, they had the germ of the idea was there, and they'd done it very well. And within, 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this someday.
It was a turning point. Jobs decided this was the way forward for Apple.
He came back and, I almost said asked, but the truth is demanded that his entire programming team get a demo of the Smalltalk system. And the then head of the Science Center asked me to give the demo because Steve specifically asked for me to give the demo. And I said, no way. I had a big argument with the Xerox executives telling them that they were about to give away the kitchen sink. And I said I would only do it if I were ordered to do it, because then, of course, would be their responsibility. And that's what they did.
The mouse is a pointing device that moves the cursor around the display screen.
Adele and her colleagues showed the Apple programmers an Alto machine running a graphical user interface.
A selected window displays above other windows, much like placing a piece of paper on top of a stack on a desk.
The visitors from Apple saw a computer that was designed to be easy to use, a machine that anybody could operate and find friendly, even the French.
Choose one.
I think mostly what we got in that hour and a half was inspiration. And basically just sort of a bolstering of our convictions that a more graphical way to do things would make this business computer more accessible.
After an hour looking at demos, they understood our technology and what it meant more than any Xerox executive understood it after years of showing it to them.
Basically, they were copier heads that just had no clue about a computer or what it could do. And so they just grabbed defeat from the greatest victory in the computer industry. Xerox could have owned the entire computer industry today. Could have been, a company 10 times its size. Could have been IBM. Could have been the IBM of the 90s. Could have been the Microsoft of the 90s.
For Steve Jobs, the road to Damascus passed through Palo Alto. He persuaded the Apple board to invest in technology copying what he'd seen at Xerox PARC, his instrument of change. They hired 100 engineers and started developing a new PC codenamed Lisa. But there were problems. The Lisa didn't work properly, and its price tag was heading toward $10,000, way too much for the average PC buyer. Jobs' domineering style drove everyone nuts, too, so the board ousted him from his own pet project.
I brooded for a few months. But it was not very long after that it really occurred to me that if we didn't do something here, the Apple II was running out of gas. And we needed to do something with this technology fast, or else Apple might cease to exist as the company that it was.
Jobs got his answer from Jeff Raskin, Apple employee number 31. Raskin's idea was a $600 computer, as easy to use as a toaster, codenamed Macintosh, after America's favorite Apple. Jobs liked the price, but not Raskin's design ideas. So Steve took over the Macintosh project, determined to make it a cheaper Lisa.
And so I formed a small team to do the Macintosh, and we were on a mission from God, to save Apple.
While Jobs pursued his Mac mission, he needed a more orthodox chief executive to run the company, a respectable face who could sell to corporate America. He chose Pepsi-Cola executive John Sculley. Sculley refused. Leave Pepsi for a 4-year-old company that had been set up in a garage? Are you serious? But it was hard saying no to Steve Jobs.
And then he looked up at me and just stared at me with this stare that only Steve Jobs has. And he said, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? And I just gulped, because I knew I would wonder for the rest of my life, what I would have missed.
Yeah, well, or usually...
For the young Mac team, average age 21, this was the start of the toughest but most exhilarating assignment of their lives, relentlessly driven by Jobs' ego.
Oh, look at this. And who's this fresh-faced young guy here?
That's me 11 years ago. Had more hair, I guess. A little thinner. Oh, I love these people. They're like family to me, really. And we were united by this common bond of trying to do this incredible thing with the Mac.
Jobs wanted the Mac to revolutionize the PC market, so he insisted that the team deliver perfection.
Steve was upset that the Mac took too long to boot up when you first turned it on. So he tried motivating Larry Kenyon by telling him, well, you know how many millions of people are going to buy this machine? There's going to be millions of people. And let's imagine that you can make it boot 5 seconds faster. Well, that's 5 seconds times a million every day. That's 50 lifetimes. If you can shave 5 seconds off that, you're saving 50 lives. And so, it was a nice way of thinking about it. And we did get it to go faster. And then this is one of the very first Macintosh wire wraps. This is wire wrap board number 4.
As the Mac progressed, new features were being continually added. Jobs said the Mac had to be insanely great and pushed his engineers to the limit. He had to, because by early 1983, Apple was in trouble. And this is what was giving Apple such a headache. IBM's first PC launched in August 1981. It was a runaway success. Within a couple of years, more than 2 million units had been shipped, overtaking Apple and making Big Blue the biggest player in the market.
When IBM personal computer owners look for good software, where can they turn? To IBM.
What was driving IBM PC sales was software.
Business programs, entertainment, productivity, education.
But software for an IBM wouldn't run on the Mac. If the Macintosh was to succeed, Jobs needed killer applications. Enter 25-year-old software supremo, Bill Gates. At that time, his company, Microsoft, had 100 workers and was growing like crazy thanks to DOS, the operating system that drove the IBM PC. But DOS sure wasn't a GUI. Gates and his aggressive number two, Steve Ballmer, were immediately intrigued by the Mac.
Jobs talked to Bill at some industry conference and said, hey, we're doing, I think Lisa was sort of in development. He said, but I'm going to do the graphical interface machine here at Apple. Not just that Lisa thing, Bill. I'm going to do the one that's really going to be the winner.
While the Mac was being developed, Jobs staged an event, a parody of a TV game show, to whip up enthusiasm among software developers.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the Macintosh software dating game.
Jobs got the 3 top software bosses of the time to sing the Mac's praises. One of them was Bill Gates. Steve didn't realize he was opening the door to the man who'd proved to be Apple's main rival.
When was your first date with Macintosh?
We've been working with the Mac for almost 2 years now, and we put some of our really good people on it, and even before we finished our work on the IBM PC, Steve Jobs came and talked about what he wanted to do, that he thought he could do sort of a Lisa, but cheaper. We said, boy, we'd love to help out. The Lisa had all its own applications, but of course they required a lot of memory, and we thought we could do better. And so Steve signed a deal with us to actually provide bundled applications for the first Mac. And so we were big believers in the Mac and what Steve was doing there.
Most people don't remember, but until the Mac, Microsoft was not in the applications business. It was dominated by Lotus. And Microsoft took a big gamble to write for the Mac.
And so we got started in early 1982 on our Macintosh software effort. And I think at that point in time, you know, it really clicked with Bill that, you know, graphic user interface was going to be the way of the future.
But while Bill was having his own GUI revelation, Jobs believed that Apple's true enemy was IBM.
Will Big Blue dominate the entire computer industry? The entire information age? Was George Orwell right about 1984?
Despite Steve Jobs' showmanship, the IBM PC was hurting Apple's business.
And most pundits considered that Apple was going to be out of business. You know, in a few short months, Business Week ran an article on their cover saying, it's over, IBM has won.
The Mac team saw themselves as Apple's pirates, but the gang was now being called on to save the ship, as the Apple II was losing precious market share.
In the case of the Macintosh team, they were behind schedule in getting the Mac out, which is not unusual in high technology. And so just getting that product to market was extremely important.
After many delays, a date for the launch of the Mac was announced. The pressure of the deadline was mounting, but Steve was still a perfectionist.
No design issue was too small, and it was never too late to do it right.
Oh, it was a pressure cooker. We were working until we finished. We couldn't go to sleep or anything. I was up for 3 days before in that very last push. And finally, just the stars aligned, and the last release we made at 6 a.m. that morning.
It was now all or nothing because Lisa had turned out an expensive flop. The fate of the whole company seemed to rest on the launch of the Mac. John Sculley had even authorized a $15 million advertising campaign to coincide with the Mac's public unveiling, January 24th, 1984.
I remember how nervous Steve was before the introduction of the Macintosh. And the rehearsal the night before was a total disaster. Nothing seemed to go right. Steve was upset at everybody. We wondered how in the world we were ever going to get through the introduction the following day. But when that moment came, Steve was a master showman.
There have only been two milestone products in our industry: the Apple II in 1977 and the IBM PC in 1981. Today, 1 year after Lisa, we are introducing the third industry milestone product, Macintosh. Many of us have been working on Macintosh for over 2 years now, and it has turned out insanely great. You've just seen some pictures of Macintosh. Now I'd like to show you Macintosh in person.
The Macintosh was undoubtedly the first affordable personal computer with a genuine graphical user interface. It was also the first computer to be a monument to one man's ego. Forget the brilliant work done at Xerox PARC and the innovations borrowed from the Lisa. On the day, only one man was claiming paternity for the Mac.
So it is with considerable pride that I introduce a man who's been like a father to me, Steve Jobs.
I was standing off stage, and as he came off, he said, "This is, the proudest, happiest moment of my life," and it was all over his face. It clearly was, because he had launched a revolution.
Ultimately, it comes down to taste. It comes down to trying to expose yourself to the best things that humans have done, and then try to bring those things in to what you're doing. I mean, Picasso had a saying, he said, good artists copy, great artists steal. And we have, always been shameless about stealing great ideas. And I think part of what made the Macintosh great was that the people working on it were musicians and poets and artists and zoologists and historians who also happen to be the best computer scientists in the world.
With delusions of grandeur running rampant, Apple created a Hollywood-style TV commercial. It symbolized how the friendly Mac would free us from the Orwellian tyranny of clunky IBM PCs. Please.
With one will, one resolve, one cause.
Despite the hype, by late 1984, the Mac's sales were disastrous.
We shall prevail.
This is a highly sophisticated office computer.
In ad after ad, Apple desperately pointed out that the Mac was far easier to use than the IBM PC, but it sold for $2,500, $1,000 more than the IBM. And despite Jobs' best efforts in recruiting software makers like Bill Gates, applications were scarce.
It didn't do very much. We had Mac Paint and Mac Write were our only applications. And the market started to figure this out. By the end of the year, people said, well, maybe the IBM PC isn't as easy to use or is not as attractive as the Macintosh, but it actually does something which we want to be able to do, spreadsheets, word processing, and database. And so we started to see the sales of the Mac tail off towards the end of 1984, and that became a problem the following year.
Cringely's third law of personal computing was right again. To succeed, a PC must have an application which alone justifies buying the whole box. The IBM PC had Lotus 1-2-3. The Mac needed its killer application.
WYSIWYG, another bunch of initials from the world of the nerds. What you see is what you get. So what's the big deal? Well, it turns out that it's very hard to print on paper exactly the same image that you see on the computer screen. 80% of our brain is devoted to processing visual data, but that's not the same for computers. I've been here writing a letter to my mom, and I'm signing it Bob in 72-point Times Roman italic type, as befitting myself. And then when I tell it to print, what comes out is a Bob, but certainly not the Bob that I'd intended. Until someone invented a way to print exactly what was on the screen, GUI would be, well, a lot of hooey.
Apple's problem was the dot matrix printer. It gave everything a typewriter quality. But salvation was at hand, and once again, it owed a lot to Xerox PARC. One of PARC's former brains, John Warnock, had invented a technology that allowed a laser printer to print exactly, precisely what was on your screen. He started a company called Adobe to market his invention.
And what we had figured out how to do that no one else had figured out how to do is drive laser printers.
Within 2 or 3 weeks, we had canceled our internal project. A bunch of people wanted to kill me over this, but we did it. And I had cut a deal with Adobe to use their software, and we bought 19.9% of Adobe at Apple.
The investment paid off. The power of precise laser-printed images and a user-friendly GUI gave birth to a brand new business, desktop publishing. The spreadsheet had made us all accountants. Now, using breakthrough software, we could create fancy artwork, snappy-looking notepaper, even counterfeit money. The Mac had found its killer application and would soon become the PC of choice for any creative business.
It changed my life. Just that one instant when I picked up the mouse, my whole life changed to building a career as a computer artist.
The success of desktop publishing came too late for Apple's founder. In 1985, Mac sales were still flat, but Jobs refused to believe the numbers. He simply behaved as if the Mac was a hot seller from the start.
The grandiose plans of what Macintosh were going to be was just so far out of whack with the truth of what the product was doing. And the truth of what the product was doing was not horrible. It was salvageable. But the gap between the two was just so unthinkable that somebody had to do something, and that somebody was John Sculley.
John Sculley, whom Jobs saw as his own creation, presented the board with his strategy to save the company. The plan did not include Steve Jobs.
The board had to make a choice, and I said, look, it's Steve's company. I was brought in here to help, you know. If you want him to run it, that's fine with me. But, you know, we've got to at least decide what we're going to do, and everyone's got to get behind it.
But he took it as a personal attack, started attacking Sculley, in which backed himself into a corner because he was sure that the board would support him and not Sculley.
And ultimately, after the board talked with Steve and talked with me, the decision was that we would go forward with my plans, and Steve left.
What can I say? I hired the wrong guy.
That was Sculley?
Yeah. And he destroyed everything I'd spent 10 years working for. Starting with me, but that wasn't the saddest part. I would have gladly left Apple if Apple would have turned out like I'd wanted it to.
People in the company had very mixed feelings about it. Everyone had been terrorized by Steve Jobs at some point or another, and so there was a certain relief that the terrorist would be gone. And on the other hand, I think there was incredible respect for Steve Jobs by the very same people. And we were all very worried what would happen to this company without the visionary, without the founder, without the charisma.
Apple never recovered from losing Steve. Steve was the heart and soul and driving force. It would be quite a different place today. They lost their soul.
The years after Steve Jobs left were the most profitable for Apple Computer.
Apple people worked hard, they played hard. They made the computer business look like a beach party. And with a median age of 27, the company was very sexy too. Maybe too sexy. There was so much sleeping around that they came up with a travel policy back then that men would share rooms with other men on the road and women with other women just to settle it down a bit. They applied the California lifestyle to the computer industry, and the computer industry would never be the same again.
Leading the forces of freedom is Macintosh.
In this bizarre promo to inspire their sales force, Apple stressed that the Mac's ease of use could liberate the pathetic prisoners of the IBM PC.
We'll fight them in the office and the classroom and the desktop with superior weapons.
With improvements to the hardware and the boom in desktop publishing, Mac production went into overdrive. By 1987, Apple was selling 1 million a year, IBM numbers.
Let's go get them.
The Mac minted money. Half its $2,000 price was pure profit.
Hello, I am Macintosh.
Apple arrogantly assumed their stuff was so good, consumers would always pay a premium for it. Big mistake.
The Mac really ought to have won the battle for the desktop. Okay, it was more expensive than an IBM PC, but if what you wanted was a friendly, easy-to-use system, and surely everyone wanted that, then this was the only game in town. At least that's what the boys at Apple thought. But they weren't reckoning on one man, Bill Gates. Gates saw that the Mac's GUI represented a long-term threat to Microsoft's money machine, to DOS, the clunky operating system that sat inside every IBM PC. So Bill had his boys create a GUI that sat on top of DOS, rather like building a fancy facade on an old building. They called it Windows, and it wasn't much at first, but it was good enough to defend the DOS franchise.
February or March of 1984, which was just right after the Apple Macintosh had been introduced. And at that point in time, we were firmly convinced that we needed to bet on graphic user interface, first with the Macintosh and then with Windows.
At Microsoft, it was a long and often frustrating struggle to find a GUI solution that challenged the Mac. I know the feeling. For years, teams of Microsofties slaved in their windowless offices to build Windows, refreshed by an endless supply of free sodas.
And I was the development manager for Windows 1.0, and we kept slogging, and yeah, it took us, I don't know, about 7 versions, but it took us a few versions to get things right before 1990, that's right.
Windows may at first have been a joke compared to the Mac, but Gates is persistent. Slowly, it got better, and the guys at Apple got worried. As each new feature appeared on the Windows GUI, the more they thought Microsoft was copying the features on the Mac. So finally, they sued Microsoft, accusing them in a long legal battle of stealing the look and feel of Apple's GUI.
The look and feel, which is how it looks, the experience of using it, was not patentable, but it was copyrightable. But there was no precedent law. This was going to be a precedent-setting case.
But it was a period of 5 years where, Microsoft, our whole strategy would have been ruined because Windows was very important to us.
They weren't going to change anything. And they were going to get us to cave in or take us all the way to the Supreme Court on this thing.
We assumed that the lawyers, the judges would all come to the right conclusion, which eventually they did.
And Apple lost. But in that period of about 6 years that this case was going on, it may have lulled us into a bit of complacency, thinking that we were going to be insulated, from the Windows attack.
The launch of Windows 3 in 1990 killed off Apple's hopes that the Macintosh would win the GUI wars.
Today we're introducing Microsoft Windows version 3.
The 6-year labor to produce a GUI that made IBM PCs and all the clones as easy to use as the Mac finally came up trumps. In a year, Windows 3 sold close to 30 million copies, consigning the Mac to a niche in the market.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Windows 3 development team.
Bill Gates' strategy won out. At every stage in the PC's development, he joined the leading hardware company, and by carving out a dominant market share for his product, made his software the industry standard.
You know, the original PC did our evangelism in the way we created tools for that, pull that together. Take Windows. Did we bet our company on that? Did that come together? Virtually everything we've done when we first come out with it, there's a lot of skepticism. But most of the things, we really stuck with them, and despite all that second guessing, we're able to pull them off.
The problem was the industry wasn't measured by who has the best-selling personal computer, or who has the most innovative technology. The industry was measured by who had the most open system that was adopted by the most other companies. And the Microsoft strategy ultimately turned out to be the better business strategy.
The only problem with Microsoft is they just have no taste. They have absolutely no taste. And what that means is, I don't mean that in a small way, I mean that in a big way. In the sense that they don't think of original ideas, and they don't bring much culture into their product. And you say, well, why is that important? Well, proportionally spaced fonts come from typesetting and beautiful books. That's where one gets the idea. If it weren't for the Mac, they would never have that in their products. And so I guess I am saddened, not by Microsoft's success. I have no problem with their success. They've earned their success, for the most part. I have a problem with the fact that they just make really third-rate products.
I will admit, quite frankly, that I think Windows today is probably 4 years behind, 3 years behind, where it would have been had we not danced with IBM for so long. Because the amount of split energy, split work, split IQ in the company really cost our end customer real innovation in our product line. And so whenever I hear these criticisms, which I got to say sting sometimes, I say to myself, just you watch Windows 95, Windows 90. There's no lack of focus. There hasn't been here for the last 3-4 years since we didn't have this big split with IBM. And I think even in the operating systems area, now you'll start to see clear, and people will recognize clear leadership.
We just keep making them better. We get millions of phone calls. We get to go out there and talk to customers, and there's nothing cast in concrete. If people decide there's something that we should change, we change it. It's a lot better than most industries in that sense. I think the way that applications user interfaces have advanced over the last decade, Microsoft has been at the forefront of a very high percentage of that. And I think it's great stuff.
On August 24th, 1995, Gates delivered the coup de grace to his software rivals. Windows 95 combines the PC's operating system and its graphical interface into one package. With a worldwide promotional campaign costing $300 million, it looks set to become the industry standard, supplanting Microsoft's old warhorse, DOS.
Thanks all of you for an incredible job.
Cue the triumph of Bill. A software nerd is the richest man in the world. But even as Bill Gates bestrides the PC world like a colossus, ahead lie bigger battles. Battles that will make the trouncing of the Mac and mastering the IBM PC look like a tea party. The Gates fortune was built on setting the industry standard for PC operating systems. Fine as long as PCs are standalone boxes on your desk. But now they are being linked into a worldwide network, the much-hyped information superhighway. The PC on the internet is a mailbox, a telephone, and a television.
Of course, at the center of this will be the idea of digital convergence. That is, taking all the information, books, art, movies, and being able to provide them on demand on what the PC will evolve into.
The internet is the next wave of the information revolution where there is as yet no industry standard. A world where even Bill Gates seems unsure.
You know, if you take the way the internet is changing month by month, if somebody can predict what's going to happen 3 months from now, 9 months from now, even today, my hat's off to them. I think we've got a phenomena here that is moving so rapidly that nobody knows exactly where it will go.
Bill Gates isn't resting on his laurels. He's making new alliances, like investing in Steven Spielberg's new movie studio, DreamWorks.
It would be silly if we were going to get into the interactive business.
He's in cable TV with broadcaster NBC and in competition with Rupert Murdoch and Mickey Mouse.
Now, as Microsoft...
These tycoons are a far cry from the nerds Bill has so far outsmarted. Guys like Gary Kildall, who became businessmen by accident. Even Bill's victory over IBM was really with a corporate outpost a long way from the attention of Big Blue headquarters. No, Bill's new rivals are hotshots, not hippies. And one of them is the guy I'm visiting. He hopes the internet will go somewhere other than to Bill Gates' bottom line. He's betting it will soon consign the PC itself to the trash can and do the same to Microsoft.
Bob Cringer, they see Larry Ellison.
Larry Ellison is the boss of Oracle, a booming business that sells software to companies who share information among hundreds of users.
This is my favorite fish, is Halloween fish.
In Atherton, the most exclusive suburb in Silicon Valley, the bachelor billionaire has built himself a $10 million samurai mansion. Naturally.
I want to have a large pond, about 5 acres of water, surrounded by several little buildings, like a village.
Oh.
And make it
With his ceremonial carp, Larry contemplates the coming battle with Microsoft.
People make a terrible mistake of thinking IBM is the present and Microsoft is the future. I think IBM is the past and Microsoft is the present, and the future has not happened, so we don't know what company, what technology is going to be dominant.
These are temple guardians from the Kamakura period, and they, you'd have one on either side of your door, and the job was to scare employees of Microsoft away and keep them from entering the temple.
We shouldn't spend all of our time wringing our hands about Microsoft world domination. That there's still room left for innovation. There's going to be change, and Microsoft's future is not assured.
That's well, anything good for the internet, we're very supportive of, because the internet does not require a PC.
Larry believes the PC will be replaced with a cheap device he calls an information appliance. It will be a glorified television which will access information and computing simply by connecting to giant computers via the internet. Just like turning on a tap, and the PC will go the way of the well and the bucket.
I hate the PC with a passion. Me going down to the store and buying Windows 95, gotta get in my car, drive down to a store, buy a cardboard box full of bits, encoded on a piece of plastic, a CD-ROM, bring it home, read a manual, and install this thing. You must be kidding. Put the stuff on the net. It's bits. Don't put bits in cardboard. Cardboard in trucks. Trucks to stores. Me go to the store. Pick this stuff out. It's insane. Okay, I love the internet. I want information. It flows across the wire.
So the way ahead is wired. Larry, Bill, everybody agrees on that. And we have the nerds of the 70s to thank for making it possible, whether the PC itself survives or not. As we take up their challenge, it's worth finding out how these pioneers made out. Steve Jobs sold all his Apple stock in disgust when he was fired, but has made another fortune from his stake in a movie animation studio. He has no doubts about his contribution to humanity.
And if you talk to people that use the Macintosh, they love it. I mean, you don't hear people loving products very often, really. But you could feel it in there. There was something really wonderful there.
Apple, the company Jobs took from a garage to the Fortune 500, is in trouble. It is now a fading force in the PC marketplace. Apple's other millionaire founder, Steve Wozniak, spends much of his time teaching computing to 11- and 12-year-olds. IBM created the mass market for the PC, but no longer sets industry standards. And most of the guys who built IBM's first PC have left Big Blue. And Ed Roberts, who built the Altair, the very first PC, he turned his back on computing and returned to his first love, medicine. Funny, isn't it, how things turn out?
After all, the first PC revolution caught us all pretty much by surprise. Even Microsoft, with 2,000 millionaires and at least 2 billionaires, never expected to be as successful as they are today.
Cringely's universal law says society takes 30 years to adapt new technology into daily life. The phone, movies, even television took that long before our rear ends became couch-shaped. So far, the PC has had 20 years. So what comes next? Well, I'm off to find out. See you in 10 years.